The message arrived not through radio, not through lightspeed relay, but through something the Dominion called the resonance web, a communication system that bypassed distance entirely by vibrating a paired crystal structure simultaneously across any span of space. The Dominion had offered access to it as a gift 3 years ago when they first made contact with humanity. They presented it the way someone hands a beggar a gold coin slowly, waiting for the eyes to go wide. Raymond Holt had accepted the crystal terminal with both hands, nodded once, and asked if there was somewhere he could get coffee. He was 61 years old, with gray at his temples, a scar along his jaw from a conflict on Earth that had ended before most of the Dominion's diplomats had been born, and a habit of carrying a folded newspaper under one arm the way other men carried briefcases. He did not look like Earth's most senior ambassador. He looked like someone's retired uncle waiting for a bus. The message that came through the resonance web on the morning of the 44th day of the third diplomatic cycle was formal, long, and composed in the High Dominion script that was meant to be read standing up. It was the kind of document that had made 17 different species surrender before it even reached its second paragraph. Holt read it sitting down, in a chair that the Dominion had provided for him aboard their diplomatic vessel, because he had complained once mildly that their standing platforms hurt his knees. The declaration ran to 4 pages. It cited humanity's unsanctioned expansion into the outer fringe, the refusal to register colony ships with Dominion territorial authority, the non-payment of passage rights through 3-star corridors, and what it called a pattern of deliberate cultural disrespect toward Dominion envoys. That last one was probably about the coffee incident. Holt read to the end, set the document down on the table beside him, and was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed, not a long laugh, not a mocking, theatrical laugh designed for an audience. It was the short, tired laugh of a man who had just seen something he had seen before in different clothes. He was still laughing slightly when he noticed the resonance channel was still open. The crystal terminal was transmitting back. On the other end, in the High Council chamber of the Dominion, 11 senior officials and Admiral Draven himself were watching his reaction in real time. He did not adjust his expression. He reached to the side of his chair, picked up the newspaper he had folded there that morning, printed on real paper, shipped from Earth on the last supply run, and opened it to the middle section. The sports results. Earth football. Scores from games played while he had been sitting in diplomatic sessions listening to the Dominion explain the proper hierarchy of the galaxy. Draven's voice came through the terminal. He was a large creature, gray-skinned, with 4 eyes arranged symmetrically, and a voice that resonated at a frequency slightly too low for comfortable human hearing. He had never failed to use that voice at full volume in Holt's presence. "Ambassador, you have received the declaration of the High Dominion. Do you understand what has been transmitted to you?" Holt did not look up from the newspaper. "Yes," he said. "You've declared war. Give us a moment." The silence on the other end lasted 4 full seconds. In Dominion diplomatic terms, 4 seconds of silence from a council chamber indicated a level of collective shock that rarely occurred outside of major military defeats. Holt turned a page. He was not performing. That was the thing that Counselor Sierra, watching from the far left of the council chamber, would think about for a long time afterward. She had studied human behavior files extensively before this posting. She had prepared for aggression, for pleading, for the specific kind of loud defiance that smaller civilizations sometimes displayed when cornered. She had not prepared for a man who appeared to have genuinely, immediately filed the declaration away under things he had already accounted for, and moved on. On Earth, the declaration had arrived simultaneously through the shared resonance terminal at the UN Security Building. The chamber was full. Generals, ministers, science advisors, and 2 heads of state who had come in person, because the diplomatic situation had been escalating for months, and everyone had sensed this moment coming. A communications officer confirmed that Ambassador Holt had received the transmission. Someone asked if he had responded. The officer looked at her screen. He sent a reply transmission, yes. What did he say? She looked up. He didn't say anything. He sent a document. It appears to be a newspaper clipping. Football scores. The room was quiet for a moment. General Volkov, who was standing at the back with a thermos he had brought from his own office, unscrewed the cap. "Good," he said, to no one in particular. "Then we're fine." Nobody asked him to explain that. A few of them already understood. The rest would later. Back on the Dominion vessel, Draven watched the open channel for another 3 minutes. Holt read his newspaper. He paused once, at something in the football results, and made a small sound of mild interest. Then he folded the paper, set it down, looked directly at the crystal terminal and said, "We'll have a formal response to you within 72 hours. I'd recommend using that time to review your fleet positioning at the outer fringe. Some of those coordinates are out of date." He reached over and closed the channel. In the council chamber, 11 officials and 1 admiral sat in silence. Sierra wrote 1 line in her personal record that evening. He was not surprised. He was never going to be surprised. We declared war on something that has been at war with itself longer than our empire has existed, and our opening move was to expect it to be frightened of us. She underlined it. Then she went to find out where on this vessel a person could get something called coffee. The Dominion Intelligence Division had predicted the collapse of 4 civilizations before those civilizations had predicted it themselves. It had never been wrong. Senior analyst Boreth had worked the human file for 9 months and had requested 3 extensions on his initial report, because every time he thought he had found the bottom of the data, there was more underneath it. Admiral Draven summoned him the morning after the declaration. Boreth arrived with a look that Draven did not like, not the look of someone delivering bad news, the look of someone who had found something they did not have a category for. "How long have humans been spacefaring?" Draven asked. 61 years formally. Before that, orbital activity for about a century. And before that? Boreth set a file on the table. It was the thickest physical document Draven had seen in 30 years of military service. Humans had been recording their own wars for 5,000 years. The written record alone contained over 400 distinct large-scale conflicts. There had been a war fought over the inheritance of a single political seat that lasted 116 years. There had been a conflict that killed between 70 and 85 million people over 6 years, and it was considered the second worst event of its type. The worst followed 21 years later. Draven looked up. They did it twice, in the same century. Yes, the second was larger. The rebuilding period after it saw the fastest technological acceleration in their recorded history. Within 15 years they had achieved orbital flight. Draven sat back. Boreth placed a second document beside the first. A statistical analysis. Human population, resource output, and innovation rate across periods of conflict versus peace. The lines did not behave correctly. In most species, existential threat caused all 3 metrics to drop. In humans, resource output and innovation rate went up. Population fell during the conflict itself, then rebounded sharply, usually within 1 generation. "They accelerate," Draven said. "Our xenopsychology team believes humans do not process large-scale threat the way other species do. Most species under existential pressure enter conservation mode, protect what exists, reduce risk. Humans appear to enter a different mode. They begin attempting things they would not have tried otherwise, because the cost of failure no longer seems higher than the cost of inaction." Boreth paused. "There is one more thing. The team identified what they called the single most dangerous data point in the entire file." "Tell me." Humanity's most destructive enemy, across their entire history, was not a foreign species. It was themselves. Internal conflict has killed more humans than all external threats combined, and they are still here. They survived themselves, Admiral. We would have to stand in a very long line to qualify as their worst problem. The room was quiet. Draven looked at his fleet map. 4,000 warships, against a species with 300 registered defense vessels and 60 years in space. The numbers still favor us, he said. Yes, Boreth said, though I would note that humans have been on the wrong side of numbers before. He left without being dismissed, which was unusual for an analyst, and which Draven decided to overlook. Alone, Draven pulled up the recording of Holt receiving the declaration. He watched it again. Holt's face was not defiant. It was not afraid. It was the face of a man doing something he had done before. That was the detail that wouldn't settle. On the Dominion vessel, Counselor Sierra found coffee in a storage corridor. A human supply technician had left a small machine there during the last provisions exchange with a handwritten note that read, "For whoever needs it." The coffee was 3 weeks old. It tasted like something used to clean engine parts. She drank the entire cup. She had read the same intelligence file as Draven. The military statistics were alarming, yes, but what stayed with her was something smaller. Humans had a common word for the act of continuing despite fear, not the absence of fear, not its removal, simply continuing anyway while the fear was still there. They had constructed an entire cultural architecture around that single concept. Songs, stories, phrases passed from parents to children across generations. The Dominion language had no direct translation. The closest phrase meant something like tolerance of necessary discomfort. It was not the same thing at all. She went to find Holt. She did not have a plan or an agenda. She had a feeling that understanding this war required understanding the person at the center of it, who had responded to a declaration of war by checking football results. He was doing the crossword when she found him, about half finished. "Counselor," he said, without looking up, "do you know a 7-letter word for what a river does when it has nowhere left to go?" She sat across from him. "No." "Neither do I," he said, "but I'll get there." She watched him think about it for a moment, pencil resting against his chin. Outside the viewport, stars moved slowly past as the vessel turned on its axis. Somewhere behind them, 30 light minutes away, Earth was already making decisions. "Ambassador," she said, "were you ever afraid today?" He looked up then, considered her for a moment with the particular attention of someone deciding whether a question deserves a real answer. "Yes," he said, "I'm afraid most days." He looked back at the crossword. "Doesn't change the puzzle." There is a concept in Dominion military doctrine called the display of overwhelming force. You do not need to destroy your enemy completely if you can make them understand, in one clear moment, that you could. Every campaign the Dominion had run in the last 2 centuries began this way. 200 warships at a target's primary defense line, holding position, broadcasting an invitation to reconsider. In every recorded instance, the target reconsidered. Draven deployed 200 ships to the outer fringe boundary at 600 Dominion Standard Time, 72 hours after the declaration. He was not expecting a fight. He was expecting the thing that always followed the display, a secondary communication from someone on the human side with less composure than the ambassador. What he got was silence, and then, 17 minutes later, a sensor reading that did not make sense. The 300 human defense vessels had split, not into 2 forces, into 11 separate groups, moving in 11 different directions at varying speeds. His tactical officer said, "They're running." Draven almost agreed, but the scattering was too even. The gaps between the 11 groups were nearly identical. That did not happen accidentally. He ordered pursuit on 3 of the largest groups, sending 60 ships. The first group led them into the asteroid processing belt between the fringe's 4th and 5th waypoints, dense with rock and old mining debris, requiring a 40% speed reduction to navigate safely. The human ships did not reduce speed. They had mapped every gap in advance. His ship slowed. The humans vanished and reappeared on the other side in a completely different formation. The second group pulled 2 Dominion cruisers into an ionically charged gas corridor. Not enough to damage hulls, but enough to interfere with targeting systems for 8 minutes. During those 8 minutes, the human ships turned, attacked their pursuers head-on at full speed, fired 6 volleys at point-blank range, and broke away clean. Draven lost 2 cruisers and a frigate in 4 minutes. The humans lost 1 ship. The third group simply stopped. Open space, nothing nearby, weapons offline, broadcasting on a standard channel. The message said, "We would like to discuss the 14 navigation beacons your fleet just passed. Please hold your current position." Draven ordered them forward anyway. 3 ships hit a gravity tether web field generators disguised as navigation markers, planted weeks earlier. The ships were not destroyed. They were slowed to a crawl, tumbling, requiring extraction by the rest of the pursuit force. When Draven pulled everyone back, he had lost 9 ships, 8 more damaged, and 0 human vessels captured. His fleet director said, "Admiral, they were never retreating." "No," Draven said, "they were planting." The entire scattering had been about moving his ships into prepared positions. The human vessels hadn't been fleeing to safety, they had been pulling his pieces into fields they had already built. He checked the sensor logs. While he had chased 3 groups, the other 8 had repositioned. Not retreated, repositioned. They were setting something else up. On the Dominion vessel, Holt received the engagement report by encoded relay. He was eating lunch. He read the numbers, set the report beside his plate, and finished his meal. Then he typed a reply to Captain Adiz Obi, Earth's forward defense commander. "Good geometry. Tell your pilots to sleep when they can." Obi replied in 4 minutes, "Already on it. They keep asking why you sent a newspaper clipping instead of a speech." Holt typed back, "A speech is what you send when you want someone to feel something. We already know how we feel. We're busy." He returned to his crossword. He had solved the river word 2 nights ago. Meanders. 7 letters. He had left it blank for a day, unsure, because Holt had a rule about crosswords. Never write an answer you are not certain of. There was no going back once the pencil touched paper. He filled it in now. Counselor Sierra came to find him there, the finished puzzle on the table, a second newspaper open. She had been in the room when Draven received the engagement report. She had watched Draven's face pass through several expressions and had not stayed to see what settled there. "They weren't trying to win that engagement," she said. "Not a question. No, they were learning what you do when surprised, and giving you something to be angry about so you'd push forward faster than you should." She sat. The outer fringe was a dark line of distant light beyond the viewport. "Is that what you would do?" she asked. "Push forward in anger?" He considered this properly. "I've done it before," he said. "Doesn't end well." She looked at him. "How long did you know this war was coming?" "About 14 months. "And what did you do with that time?" He folded the newspaper. "Prepared the ground," he said. "Farming." She wanted to ask more, but something in the way he said it, not proudly, not as a warning, just as a plain statement of fact, made her sit with it instead. Outside, a distant cluster of Dominion ships moved across the sensor display in slow formation, searching for a human perimeter that had already dissolved and reformed somewhere else entirely. "They are very good at this," she said quietly. "They've had a lot of practice," Holt said. He opened the new newspaper. "Sports section's yours if you want it." She did not know what sports section meant, but she took the half he offered, and they sat in silence. And for the first time since the declaration had arrived, the silence felt less like a gap and more like a kind of understanding. 41 days into the campaign, Draven's cartographer brought him a map he had not asked for. On the left, Dominion fleet positions at the start. On the right, where those same ships were now. They had advanced. 17 fringe waypoints taken, 2 forward staging areas established. The human defense line pushed back roughly 4 light hours. They had also lost 412 ships. Draven had not asked for the comparison because he already knew the numbers. He read the daily loss report every morning, standing, alone, before his officers arrived. He did not want anyone watching his face. 412 ships in 41 days, against a species that had started with 300. The math should not have been possible, but the math had stopped being the right tool for understanding this war about 3 weeks ago. The humans were not fighting conventionally. They were giving up the fringe, deliberately, one waypoint at a time, while making each step of the advance more expensive. Abandoned waypoints were left with fuel lines that ran dry navigation data that was subtly wrong, automated resupply systems that sent request signals back to Dominion Command, and then delivered nothing. None of these problems alone would stop a warship. Across 41 days and 17 waypoints, they added up to a fleet burning 15% more fuel than projected, running 8% below sensor efficiency, and spending 12% of crew hours on maintenance that should not have existed in military-grade hardware. The humans were not fighting his fleet. They were wearing it down, layer by layer, like water on stone. He requested reinforcements. The High Council authorized 600 additional ships from the secondary reserve, and noted, carefully, that this was the final available allocation. Further reinforcement would require pulling from active border patrols, creating vulnerabilities in 3 other sectors. Draven read that message 3 times. He went and stood at the engagement map and did arithmetic that had nothing to do with the human fleet. He had started with 4,000 ships. He now had 3,500 plus the incoming 600, against an enemy that had not lost more than 60 vessels in the entire campaign. The human ship count wasn't the point. The point was that Dominion losses were unsustainable over time, and time was exactly what the humans were selling. They had set the price in Dominion hulls, and they were the only sellers. Counselor Sierra had stopped attending the daily tactical briefings. She spent that time in the diplomatic corridor with Holt, which she had not been authorized to do and had not asked permission for. On the 43rd day, she brought him a data card and set it on the table without explaining it. "What is this?" he asked. "Our cartography division mapped human infrastructure, colonies, supply routes, communication relays. Non-military, we expected to find them exposed. Easy leverage." She paused. "There is almost nothing there. The fringe colonies were partially evacuated before the campaign began, supply routes rerouted, communication relays replaced with dummies. Either your people anticipated exactly where we would look, or we moved it before you had a chance to look," he said. 14 months, she said. 14 months, he confirmed. She sat back. The stars outside held still in a way that felt different from the early days. "What does your side actually want?" she asked. "Not political language, the real thing." Holt was quiet. He folded his hands and thought about how to say something true in a language not built for it. "To be left alone," he said. "Not because we are weak, because we are busy. We are building things. We have places to go and enormous work ahead of us, and this," he gestured at the air between them, meaning all of it, "this is a distraction. We did not start it. We would have been glad to pay passage rights on those corridors if anyone had asked us like a neighbor instead of informing us like a subject." Sierra looked at the data card. "Was anyone going to ask you like a neighbor?" He said nothing. She had her answer. "I am asking as myself, not as the council's representative," she said. "Is there a version of this that ends without one side being destroyed?" Holt picked up the newspaper from the side of his chair. He did not open it, just held it. "That depends on whether the people with authority are willing to talk before the cost gets higher. What if I told you I might be able to arrange that conversation?" He set the newspaper down. Something in his expression changed, not calm exactly. Alert. The look of a man who had been waiting for a specific door and had just heard the handle turn. Then I would tell you, he said quietly, to take your time and do it right. She nodded and stood to leave. At the door she stopped. The humans you evacuated from the fringe colonies, she said. Where did you put them? Holt thought for a moment. Somewhere safe, he said, and somewhere close enough to go back. She left. He opened the newspaper. He did not read it for a while. He just sat with it in his hands, thinking about timing and patience, and the difference between a door that opens and a door that is opened for you. On Earth, Volkov received a field report from Obi. The Dominion's forward fleet had slowed its advance for the first time since the campaign began. Not stopped, slowed. He made a note of it and sent a single line back to Holt's relay. Clock is ticking the right direction. Don't rush it. Holt received the message, read it, and typed back 2 words, never do. Then he finally opened the newspaper. The High Council of the Dominion held its emergency session on the 67th day without telling Admiral Draven it was happening. This had never occurred before in the history of Dominion military governance. The admiral of an active campaign was always present during strategic review. It was doctrine. They excluded him because 3 council members had done the same arithmetic Draven had done a month ago and arrived at a number nobody wanted to say in front of a military man whose career was attached to the outcome. At current attrition rates, a successful occupation of Earth's orbital space would leave the Dominion with roughly 800 operational vessels. Against a species whose actual military reserve capacity, the ships not yet deployed, the things kept back, had been revised upward 3 times by intelligence teams since the campaign began. The humans had 300 ships on paper. They appeared to have considerably more, somewhere else, doing nothing yet. Sierra was present. She had filed a diplomatic necessity request, which the council could have refused and had not, because refusal would have required explaining it to the Governance Charter Review Board. She listened to 4 hours of debate, then requested the floor. The campaign, she said, is achieving its military objectives and losing its strategic purpose. The Dominion declared war to establish authority over a species that did not recognize Dominion governance. After 67 days, that species not only still does not recognize it, it has demonstrated to every watching species that Dominion authority can be resisted without self-destruction. The longer this continues, the worse that lesson becomes, but there may be an exit. She did not describe the exit. She said only that a diplomatic framework was possible that would let both parties end the campaign without either formally surrendering. She needed authorization from the council, not the admiral, because what she intended required flexibility that military command structures were not built to allow. They authorized her in 40 minutes. She found Holt in the corridor near the coffee machine, sitting on a supply crate, reading a paperback book. When she asked what it was, he said, "A newspaper but longer with a story instead of news." She considered this and decided it made sense. "They authorized you," he said before she could speak. "How did you know I had been to the council?" "You walked in like someone who'd been given permission and was still checking whether it covered everything she actually needed." She sat across from him. "What can you agree to without returning to Earth first?" "Most things. I have broad authority. The Dominion cannot formally request a ceasefire. If the Council initiates it, it signals weakness to the member species watching. Some have been waiting for exactly that opening." She paused. "But if the human side proposed a framework framed as a diplomatic initiative rather than a military concession, the Council could respond to it. Present it internally as the Dominion choosing restraint rather than being forced to stop." "We propose it," Holt said, "so it looks like we're the ones asking." "Yes. And what do we actually receive for letting you save face?" "Formal recognition of human territorial sovereignty in the outer fringe, no passage rights, no tribute, no registration requirements, a buffer zone maintained by mutual agreement." Holt looked at his book. He thought about 14 months of preparation. He thought about Obi and the pilots sleeping in shifts, the families in temporary shelter waiting to go home, Volkov drinking tea at 300. He thought about the crossword rule. Do not write the answer until you are certain. One addition, he said. The buffer zone is jointly administered. Equal seats, equal authority, not Dominion monitored and human tolerated. That will require internal negotiation. Take the time you need. She stood. At the corridor entrance she stopped. She had been carrying something for 67 days. Before the war, she said, your people were only requesting passage rights. The recognition, the sovereignty, the joint administration. This is more than your original diplomatic position asked for. Yes, he said. So the war got you more than negotiation would have. He looked at her. We got it because we were willing to pay the cost of it, he said. That is not the same thing as wanting the war. She nodded, she left. He stayed in the corridor for a while, not reading. The coffee machine hummed beside him. He listened to the sound of it, small, ordinary, the sound of something that did not care about declarations or fleets or attrition rates. Just a machine doing its one job. Then he took out paper and spent 6 hours writing the most important document of his career, a proposal that would end a war by making it look like neither side was ending it. Language built like a bridge, wide enough for both sides to walk across without their boots touching. He worked until the light through the small viewport changed. Then he went asleep. On Earth, Volkov received a single encoded word from Holt's relay, the prearranged signal they had agreed on 14 months ago for exactly this moment. He set his thermos down, told his aide to clear the next 3 days, and went to inform the UN Security Council that the war was almost over. They would not need to do anything dramatic. The whole point was that nobody would. The treaty was signed on a station that belonged to neither side. An old Velhari observation platform, abandoned for 2 decades, sitting in neutral space between the outer fringe boundary and the nearest Dominion waypoint. Someone had cleaned it. The human side sent a maintenance crew a week ahead to check life support, repair the lighting, and leave a table and chairs. The Dominion side sent a ceremonial banner. Neither had asked the other to do these things. They had simply, separately done them, which felt right somehow. Admiral Dravin came in person. His presence was not required. The treaty could have been signed by legal representatives on both sides. It was a choice, and everyone in the room noticed when he walked in. He looked, Holt thought, like a man who had been carrying something heavy and was not sure whether setting it down would feel like relief or like losing a fight. Possibly both. Possibly those were the same thing sometimes. The signing took 11 minutes. The document's language was Holt's, careful, precise, built to be read in the most favorable possible interpretation by both sides simultaneously. He had spent years learning to write that way. Not deceptive. Wide enough for 2 understandings to walk through the same door without colliding. When it was done, people moved into the adjoining room. The human delegation had brought coffee. The Dominion brought Sherath, a warm grain drink consumed at the end of formal occasions. Sierra poured herself a cup of each and stood at the viewport, looking at the fringe stars. Dravin approached Holt when the room had thinned. He stopped at a respectful distance, arms at his sides in the Dominion posture for speaking without rank. The newspaper, Dravin said. When you received the declaration and opened it, I assumed it was a performance, a deliberate insult. It wasn't, Holt said. I know that now. I would like to understand what it was. Holt looked at his coffee cup before answering. Real answers sometimes needed a moment. I've carried a newspaper every day since my first deployment, 40 years ago. There was a conflict on Earth. It was real and it was bad, and for 8 months I didn't know how it would end. Every morning I found a newspaper, because a newspaper is an ordinary thing. It means a printing press is running somewhere. It means someone is worried about football scores. It means the ordinary world is still going, outside of whatever the worst thing is. When the declaration came in, I laughed because I recognized it. I have seen declarations before. I know what comes after them. He gestured at the station around them. Tables, chairs, refreshments, signatures. Draven was quiet. You were not afraid. I was afraid every day. The newspaper was also for that. Draven looked at him with an expression Holt recognized after a moment. The expression of someone who had expected an enemy and found something else, and was still working out how to hold it. We would not have backed down, Draven said. If the cost had not become what it did, we would have pushed through. I know, Holt said, we accounted for that. And if you had lost, we would have made it expensive enough that the next calculation would be different. Draven made a sound with no translation, not quite a laugh, something that sat between them like an acknowledgement. Then he left. Holt stood at the viewport with his coffee, watching the Dominion ships begin their long withdrawal. The fringe families would start returning home before the withdrawal was complete. Obi had already sent the first convoy. Sierra came to stand beside him. The Joint Administration Committee meets in 30 days, she said. I have been asked to serve as the Dominion's first representative. She paused. I suggested you for the human seat. I suspected you might. She looked out at the stars. I found something in our cultural archive, an old phrase from before the Empire, from the age of our own early conflicts. She told him. It translated roughly as, the will that does not wait for the fear to stop. That is close, he said. Not the same. He thought about it. Ours is simpler. We call it going anyway. She was quiet. Then, I received something this morning. Our cultural division has apparently started following Earth sports. One of your football teams won something significant. She passed him a data card. I was told it might belong on page 1. He took it, looked at it, smiled, a real one, the kind that moved the scar along his jaw. He folded the card and put it in his jacket pocket, next to the newspaper he still carried, because some habits were not about the thing itself but about the space it held in the day. The space that said, the world is still going. The ordinary things are still here. Outside, the stars were quiet. Inside, people talked across the table and drank coffee and Shereth side by side, and signed their names to a document that made the galaxy slightly less likely to burn itself down. That was enough, Holt thought. That was always enough.